Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterism Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and this is what I call my morning musings. I do appreciate so very much you being with me, and hope your week has gone really well. Hope you're enjoying this really hot weather. As I have shared with you, here in southern Oklahoma, we have had just an incredibly hot summer. Just recently, my wife and I were driving into town, and the temperature gauge on her vehicle. Now, we were driving into the sun, okay, no question about that. But we were driving into the sun, and her temperature gauge on her vehicle said it was 117 degrees. Now, I don't know what the heat index was that particular day, maybe 450 degrees or something like that, or at least what it seemed like. But boy, oh boy, oh boy, it has just been incredibly hot. Now, mind you, I always get a bang out of this. We are told by the climate change folks, and you look, you just have put me down as one of those skeptics, because I remember days when I was a kid in which we had this kind of extremely hot weather. I remember days when I was a kid that during the winters we had incredibly cold winters. And by the way, in the places where I lived, we had tons and tons of snow. And a point of fact is, not long ago, I was watching, I don't want to get sidetracked too much on this, but I was watching the weather, and the particular weatherman was evidently a climate change skeptic as well. And by the way, I've just got to throw this in there. I don't have any doubt whatsoever that climate does change from time to time. But when you go back through time, when you go back through recorded history, it's easy to find periods of time in which the climate has just been radically worse or radically better than it is now. So anyway, this weatherman, he was talking about how hot it has been. And yet he was showing from the graphs, from the charts, from the history, how, for instance, I think he said, if memory serves me correctly, you'll have to forgive me if I get the date exactly wrong, but it seemed like he said around 1925, the temperatures were every bit as much as they are right now. Now, supposedly, right now, we're experiencing historically bad weather. Fact is, no, we're not. So much for that, all right? All right, we continue our study of the challenge of Christ. And the challenge of Christ, remember, very serious. Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Now, I have been issuing that challenge to Christian after Christian believer over and over. Number one, it stuns me. It literally stuns me how few Christians realize that Jesus issued such a challenge. Point number two, it stuns me when I discuss the challenge of Christ with believers, how ill-equipped they are to meet the challenges of the atheist, the agnostics, the skeptics, who gladly look at the challenge of Christ and they say, aha, see, Jesus said, if he didn't do what he said he was going to do, not to believe him, but he said he was going to come back in the first century. He didn't do that. Therefore, by Jesus' own words, we shouldn't believe him. And you know he didn't come back like he said he was going to. And that, of course, is when I, shall I express it like this? That's when I spring the trap. And I say, no, you don't understand. He did meet his own challenge. I'll never forget some years ago, my friend William Bell, he told me this story how one evening, doorbell rang. He went to the door. And there were a couple of Muslim individuals at the door. And they said, we'd like to give you our testimony. We'd like to talk to you about the prophet. So we invited them in. They had no idea what was going to come to them. So they said, would you become a follower of Muhammad if we could show you blah, blah, XXX? And he said, well, that's interesting. And they said, well, if we can show you that Jesus was a false prophet, would you follow Muhammad instead? And he goes, well, I'd like to accept that challenge, but let me turn that around. But he said, let me ask you first how you would proceed to prove that Jesus is a false prophet. And these Muslim spokesmen said, Jesus said he was coming back in the first century, and they quoted Matthew 16, 27 and 28. And they said, it's very obvious Jesus did not come back in the first century with his angels and judge every man before all those people died. William sat and listened to them. He then issued his own challenge. And he said, well, let me turn that around. And he said, if I can prove to you that Jesus kept his word and that he came back in the first century with his angels in judgment, what would that prove? And they said, well, it would prove he's the Son of God. And he said, and would that not prove that as the Son of God, Muhammad is not the prophet of God? Well, that kind of slowed him down just a little bit, but finally one of them said, well, yeah. So William proceeded to share with them many of the things that I've been sharing with you here on Now TV for the last 2 years. That Jesus' promise to come in the glory of the Father meant that he was going to come as the Father had come many, many times before. He came in the judgment of Egypt at the hands of the Assyrians under Sargon. And by the way, it's very interesting. I shared with you recently. I recently had an interview on a blog, an internet blog, hosted by a guy who is a, quote, unbeliever. He's kind of a skeptic. He's not a hostile atheist by any stretch of the imagination. But as I shared with him what Jesus said, what the Old Testament says about the Father having come many times before, this guy's total demeanor changed. All of a sudden, his body language was one of interest. It was no longer, with a little smirk here and a little smirk there. And for the next 45 minutes, almost an hour, he sat with rapt attention. And at the close of the program, when I had to go, he said, you know what? This has been really, really interesting to me. Now listen, ladies and gentlemen, this challenge of Christ is real. Well, to go back to the story about William Bell and the Muslims, after he shared with them for a good long while about how Yahweh had come many times in the Old Testament, and yet he had never come literally, visibly, bodily out of heaven, but he had come by using this nation over here to judge this nation over here. And he came on the clouds. He came in flaming fire. He came with a shout. He came with the angels. He destroyed heaven and earth. Obviously not literally, not visibly, not materially. At the end of the study, he posed the question to those Muslims. And he said, did Jesus keep his word? And both of them said, yes, he did. Ladies and gentlemen, they saw. Now, they were utilizing Jesus' own words. They thought to destroy the faith in Christ. But as it turned out, they both admitted that Jesus had spoken the truth. And that as a result of that, they had to admit he was not a false prophet. Now, neither one of them wanted to admit the full consequences of that, which meant that Muhammad is the one who's a false prophet. But they admitted that Jesus is not a false prophet. This is the power of preterism. This is the power of being able to show that Jesus kept his word. Now, over the last several weeks, I've been sharing with you from the book of Revelation. Number one, the book of Revelation is about the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show to his servants things which must shortly come to pass. Now, obviously, the commentators make every excuse in the world to escape the force of shortly. They say, well, it means rapidly, not soon. Or it means, well, when it finally gets around to be the time, then it will happen quickly. None of which are satisfactory or textual or contextual. And here's the point of this. If it is true, ladies and gentlemen, and it is, if it is true that the events of the book of Revelation were genuinely, objectively, near, coming soon, coming shortly from John's perspective, then that means that all futurist eschatologies are false. Because that means it is wrong to put the destruction of Babylon into our future 2,000 years removed from the time in which the Father told Jesus to tell John, to tell the churches, these things must shortly come to pass. The Father did not tell the Son to tell John, to tell the churches, shortly doesn't mean at hand, quickly, and soon. It means one day by and by. Or it means rapidly and not soon. It's not what the Father said. So once again, if it is the case, and it is, that the events of Revelation were genuinely, objectively, near, coming soon, coming shortly and quickly from John's temporal position, then that means the judgment of Babylon is not in our future. It means the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection is not in our future, because that violates the objective nature of the language. And I hope that you have caught the power of that message. Because once we do, once we understand that the book of Revelation is emphatically posited, explicitly posited, undeniably posited, to be fulfilled within a very, very short time of when John wrote it. And he wrote it just before Peter wrote his first epistle. I'll develop that later on, but I think it's a given fact. I know that goes against the flow, but I believe it's absolutely true. So from a very short period of time, from when John said and was told, these things must shortly come to pass, that means the judgment of Babylon, the coming of the Lord, judgment, resurrection, the end of the millennium, and the arrival of the new heaven and the new earth. All of those things were genuinely, objectively near, coming soon, coming shortly. They were at hand. Now, having established that, by looking at the Greek term entokai, which I demonstrated, contrary to so many commentators, which does not mean rapidly as opposed to soon, but means soon. And by the way, that's the way that all English translations render Revelation 1 and 1. You know, don't you think it's strange, ladies and gentlemen? And I've just got, and I don't want to spend much more time on this particular aspect of it, but don't you think it kind of strange that when commentator after commentator says, well, you know, the Greek term entokai, what it really means is rapidly, not soon. Quickly, not shortly. Don't you think that at least one Bible translation would translate it as rapidly and not soon? Instead, every single English translation renders Revelation 1 verse 1, these things must shortly or soon or very quickly happen, come to pass, be fulfilled, etc. Now, ladies and gentlemen, many of these translations were rendered by people who want to say entokai meant rapidly and not soon. But their Greek scholarship would not allow them to render it that way. They knew linguistically you can't translate it as rapidly and not soon. Well, I have to move on here. Not only does Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1 say these things must shortly come to pass, but in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 3, the Father said to Jesus to tell John to tell the churches, blessed is he who reads and understands the things that are written in this book, because the time has drawn near, or the time is at hand. Now, the word that is translated as the time is from the Greek word Kairos. Kairos is an absolutely fascinating, and let me emphasize this, absolutely critical word for understanding biblical eschatology. Now, before delving into Kairos, and let me give you a little bit of a tidbit. Let me give you just a little bit of a touch of the palate, as it were, for what we are going to investigate when we study Kairos itself in depth. Kairos means appointed time. As many, many commentators say, and as Robert Trench in his book, Synonyms of New Testament Greek Words, says, you know, there are two words that are translated as time in the New Testament. You have chronos. That's the word we get our word chronology, the study of time. Chronos simply means time. Now, used with other words, It can mean designated or appointed time. But chronos by itself does not does not indicate what time it is. All right? And that's important. It can just simply be talking about sometime, anytime, whatever time. That's not the word that is used in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 3. This is the Greek word Kairos. Kairos, according to Trench, in his synonyms of the Greek New Testament, Kairos means a divinely appointed time. Now, I want you to think about that, and I want you to let it soak in. Let me say that again. Kairos means divinely appointed time. It means that out of the entire chronos, okay, the entire flow of time, or the entire period of time, and yes, you can have specially designated periods of chronos, all right? But out of the entire flow of time, you have a specially designated, a specially appointed time for whatever is being discussed, and that is the Kairos. Now, I believe if you'll think about that for just about a nanosecond, I believe you will see a train coming because, oh, and by the way, let me make this, less than a millimeter caveat. There are just a few places, very, very, very few places in the New Testament in which it might be argued that Kairos does not mean divinely appointed time. One real quick example. In Matthew chapter 21 and Mark chapter 12, which is the parallel, Jesus told a parable about the owner of a vineyard, and he let it out to husbandmen. And the text says, when the time came for the harvest, he sent out his servants to gather go to the vineyard and to gather the harvest. Now, one could argue that in the parable, it's just simply saying, well, when the time of the harvest came. And that would be true. But it's still a designated time, isn't it? You have spring, summer, fall, and winter. Those are the appointed times. And you can even argue these are the divinely appointed times of Genesis chapter 1. Because after all, God set the sun, the moon, the stars in the sky to be for times and for seasons, for days, for weeks, for months, and years. So all of the seasons, including the time of the harvest, is in one sense a divinely appointed time. Well, I'm going to give you just a few facts, like I said, just to touch the palate a little bit. I'm not going to have time to develop this, and I don't intend to develop it in today's video. But I simply want you to catch just a little bitty bit of the flavor of how important Kairos is. Okay? The Greek word Kairos appears 80, let me look at my notes here. I think that's correct. 85 times in the New Testament. So it is a common word, but when a person goes down through the entire list of occurrences of Kairos, one cannot help but be struck of how important that word really is for understanding biblical eschatology. It is not a word that is used loosely, indiscriminately. It is rather used in one context after another to point out that the special prophesied, the special appointed time found in the Old Testament prophets had arrived. And that gets really, really exciting. Now, to give you just a flavor of this, and by the way, no other book in all of the Old Testament uses, in the Greek Septuagint, no other book uses the word Kairos more than does the book of Daniel. So that's something you need to know. Over and over and over again, Daniel was told about the appointed time of the end. Now, in Daniel chapter 8 and in the early sections of Daniel chapter 10, we have some designations of the appointed time which are not eschatological, but they are appointed in God's scheme of eschatology. They're not talking about the last days. They're talking about some appointed times before the last days arrived. Well, I'm out of time for today, so be looking forward to it next week at the appointed time.